Picture this. You're 6 years old. Instead of walking into a classroom, someone hands you a spear. Imagine being 9, and your job is to walk into a field alone before sunrise. Because if you don't, your family doesn't eat tonight. Imagine turning 12 and being told you are now officially an adult. No graduation, no slow transition, no time to figure out who you are. One day you are a child, the next day you are expected to survive like one never existed. For most of human history, this wasn't cruelty. This was normal. This was Tuesday. So here's the question that should unsettle you a little. If childhood, as we know it, is a modern invention, then what were children actually living through for the other 300,000 years of human existence? Most people assume childhood has always looked roughly the same. Some innocence, some play, some protection from the harsh parts of life. A time to grow slowly, make mistakes safely, and be shielded by adults who loved you. That assumption is comforting. It's also, historically speaking, almost completely wrong. For thousands of years, in almost every civilization we've uncovered, childhood was not a protected phase of life. It was a probationary one. You weren't cherished simply for existing. You were watched to see if you would survive long enough to become useful, and useful long enough to be worth feeding. This isn't a story historians like to put on postcards. It's not the version taught with soft lighting and gentle music, but it's the truth buried under centuries of bones, letters, court records, and skeletons with growth patterns that tell us exactly how hard those early years really were. And once you understand what childhood actually was, you start to understand something even more important. You start to understand why so many of us, right now, in the modern world, still carry invisible rules in our nervous systems that were written thousands of years ago. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of history, the beginning of what it meant to be a child at all. In ancient Rome, a newborn baby had no automatic right to live. The father held that power. When a child was born, it was placed on the ground in front of him. If he picked the baby up, it was accepted into the family. If he turned and walked away, the child could be left outside to die of exposure, a practice historians call infant exposure. This wasn't rare, it wasn't hidden, it was legal, and in many cases socially expected, especially for daughters or children with visible disabilities. Now sit with that for a second. A person's entire right to exist depended on a 5-second decision made by someone else. In ancient Sparta, the stakes were just as brutal, but the criteria were different. Spartan elders inspected newborns for weakness. If a baby seemed physically unfit, it could be left on a hillside, exposed to the elements, given a chance only nature would judge. Survival wasn't about being loved. It was about being strong enough to be worth the resources. And if you did survive infancy in Sparta, congratulations. At age 7, you were taken from your home and placed into a brutal military training system called the agoge. Cold nights, deliberate hunger. Physical punishment used not as discipline, but as a teaching tool. The goal wasn't to raise a happy child. The goal was to forge a soldier who could withstand pain without flinching. This is the part that quietly reframes everything. Childhood in most of history was not designed around the emotional well-being of the child. It was designed around the survival needs of the group. And that single shift in purpose explains almost everything else we're about to talk about. Because once you understand that ancient societies weren't trying to be cruel for cruelty's sake, but trying to survive a world with brutal famine cycles, high disease rates, and constant threat, the harshness starts to make a different kind of sense. Not an excusable kind, but an understandable one. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because they matter more than most people realize. In many ancient and medieval societies, it's estimated that somewhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 2 children died before reaching adulthood. Let that sink in. Not 1 in 100. Not a rare tragedy whispered about in hushed tones, a near coin flip. When death is that common, something strange and quietly devastating happens to human psychology. Parents, without even realizing it, begin to emotionally hedge their bets. Attachment theory, a psychological framework developed by John Bowlby in the 20th century, tells us that human bonding is deeply wired into our biology, but it's also shaped by environment. In places where infant death was extremely common, some historians and psychologists argue that parents unconsciously delayed full emotional investment in a child until that child proved it would survive the most dangerous early years. This wasn't coldness, it was self-protection. You cannot lose a piece of your heart 50% of the time and remain functional. So many ancient cultures created emotional distance as a defense mechanism, sometimes not even naming a child formally until it passed a certain age. Here's where the psychology becomes even more fascinating, and honestly, a little haunting. Children raised in these high mortality, high labor environments developed what modern psychologists would now recognize as extremely early hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is a heightened, almost constant state of alertness to danger. It's something we now associate with trauma responses in adults. But in ancient childhood, it wasn't a disorder. It was a survival skill, taught early, reinforced daily. A child who noticed danger first survived. A child who cried too long without stopping to observe their surroundings sometimes didn't. Over generations, this created something remarkable. Children whose nervous systems matured faster, whose emotional expression was more controlled, and whose sense of self often formed around usefulness rather than individuality. Think about that phrase for a second. Identity formed around usefulness, not individuality. In the modern world, we ask children, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" It's a question rooted in possibility, imagination, personal desire. In the ancient world, that question would have made very little sense. The real question was, what do you need to be so this family survives the winter? This single difference in psychological framing shaped entire personalities, entire life trajectories, entire generations of humans who grew up believing their worth was tied directly to their output. And if that sentence made something in your chest tighten just slightly, you're not imagining things. Because many of us, thousands of years later, in comfortable homes with heating and refrigerators and modern medicine, still carry that exact same belief system. We'll come back to that. But first, let's meet some of these children. Not statistics, people. Picture a girl in ancient Egypt, maybe 8 years old, living near the Nile. Her days don't include books or games in the way we imagine childhood today. Instead, she wakes before dawn to help grind grain by hand, a task that could take hours and would eventually wear down joints far too early in life. Archaeologists studying skeletal remains from this era have found signs of repetitive stress injuries in children this young, evidence etched permanently into bone. She isn't being punished. She is simply doing what every girl her age does. This is what growing up looks like. Picture a boy in medieval Europe, maybe 10, working as an apprentice to a blacksmith. He doesn't live with his parents anymore. He was sent away, a common practice at the time, to learn a trade under a master who has full authority over him, including the right to physically discipline him. Homesickness isn't really acknowledged as something children have space to feel. Crying is seen as weakness that needs correcting, not an emotion that needs comfort. He learns quickly to keep his face still no matter what he feels underneath it. Picture a child in ancient Mesopotamia, maybe 7, already promised in marriage or already working in a family trade. Because childhood there wasn't measured by age, it was measured by capability. The moment you could carry water, tend animals, or care for a younger sibling, you crossed an invisible line. You stopped being someone who is cared for and started being someone who cares for others. Picture a child during the Black Death in the 14th century, maybe 6 years old, standing in a home where a parent has just died, with no adult left who has the emotional bandwidth to explain what death means or comfort the fear that comes with it. Grief in this era was often processed alone, quickly, because survival didn't pause for mourning. There were animals to feed and mouths to fill, whether your heart was broken or not. And picture, finally, a child in colonial-era households, maybe 5 or 6, already learning specific chores tied strictly to gender, already absorbing, without anyone explicitly saying it out loud, that their value in the family was tied to how much labor they could contribute, not how much joy they could bring simply by being present. These aren't isolated horror stories. These were normal childhoods, repeated across millions of homes for thousands of years. And here's the truly uncomfortable part. These children grew into adults. Adults who raised the next generation of children the exact same way, because it was the only blueprint they had ever known. Trauma doesn't just disappear at the end of a hard childhood. Without intervention, it gets passed down, generation after generation, quietly folded into what we call normal parenting, or just how things are done. This is where psychology gives us a word that explains so much of human history: intergenerational trauma. It's the idea that the emotional patterns, coping mechanisms, and even nervous system responses of one generation can be transmitted to the next, not through stories, but through behavior. A mother who was taught that crying was weakness raises a child who learns to hide tears too. A father who was taught that love had to be earned through obedience raises a child who grows up chasing approval instead of feeling safe in connection. Multiply that across hundreds of generations, and you start to see something remarkable. Many of the emotional struggles people quietly battle today, the fear of resting without guilt, the belief that you must constantly prove your worth, the discomfort with receiving love without earning it first, aren't random personality quirks. They're echoes, faint inherited echoes of childhoods lived thousands of years ago, when survival genuinely depended on usefulness and emotional toughness. So, what do we actually do with this knowledge? Because understanding history is powerful, but understanding without action just becomes sad trivia. The first step is recognizing the pattern in yourself without shame. If you notice that you struggle to rest without feeling guilty, or that you tie your self-worth heavily to productivity, this isn't a personal flaw. It's a psychological inheritance. Simply naming it out loud or in your own mind begins to loosen its grip, because awareness interrupts automatic behavior. Psychologists call this metacognition, the ability to observe your own thought patterns rather than being controlled by them. The moment you can say, "This reaction isn't really about today, it's an old survival pattern," you gain a small but real amount of power over it. The second step is intentionally practicing what ancient childhoods almost never allowed: emotional expression without punishment. If you're a parent, this might look like letting your child cry without rushing to shut it down, showing them that emotions are safe to express, not a threat to be managed. If you're an adult healing your own inner child, this might look like allowing yourself to feel sadness or fear without immediately judging yourself for it. This works because emotional suppression doesn't remove pain, it only stores it. Expression, done safely, actually helps regulate the nervous system over time, something modern trauma-informed therapy consistently confirms. The third step is redefining worth outside of usefulness. This is harder than it sounds because for most of human history, worth and usefulness were the same thing. But you are allowed to rest without earning it. You are allowed to be loved without constantly proving your value through output. Practicing this daily, even in small ways like taking a break without guilt or accepting help without feeling like a burden, slowly rewires a belief system that is, quite literally, thousands of years old. And the fourth step, maybe the most powerful one, is simply talking about this. Trauma historically thrived in silence. Ancient children didn't have language for what they were experiencing. They didn't have therapists, support groups, or even the concept that emotional pain deserved attention. We have all of that now. Every time you speak openly about emotional struggle instead of hiding it, you're doing something your ancestors, for thousands of years, were never given the safety to do. So here's where we land, after everything. Childhood, for most of human history, was not a soft place. It was a proving ground. Children were shaped less by love and more by necessity, less by comfort and more by survival. And in a strange, quiet way, that shaped every single one of us walking around today, whether we realize it or not. But here's the part that should give you hope instead of heaviness. For the first time in human history, we don't just survive childhood, we're finally starting to understand it. We have the language, the science, and the awareness to break patterns that were unknowingly passed down for millennia. You are not required to carry forward what was handed to you. You are allowed to rest without guilt. You are allowed to be loved without earning it. You are allowed to feel fully without hiding it. Somewhere, thousands of years ago, a child stood in a field at dawn, exhausted, unseen, simply trying to survive the day. That child never got the chance to just be a child. You do, and maybe that's the quiet, powerful truth hiding underneath all of this history. Healing isn't just about understanding the past. It's about finally giving yourself what generations before you never had the chance to receive.